5 introduces what we call resource markets and factor markets, which really the big takeaway from Unit 5 is the labor market, which is you, the individual, now supply your labor and the businesses demand the labor. So while we've spent the past 4 units in the product market where consumers demand the product and producers supply the product, now we just literally turn the economy upside down and you are now the supplier and you supply your labor. The businesses now demand the labor and in return they pay you a wage. So that's all that's going on, is that it's the exact same concept as supply and demand for a product, but now we look at the supply and demand for labor. But it's literally the exact same thing, it's just the roles have reversed as who supplies and who demands. But this is that circular flow diagram or circular flow chart we saw probably back in Unit 1, I think. But all it's showing you is that this is where we've spent all the time so far, down here at the bottom, where the businesses supply the goods and services, the individuals demand the goods and services. Well, now we're going to be up here in the resource market, factor market, labor market. It's all the same thing, interchangeable terms. But you, the individual, now supply your labor to the resource market. The businesses now demand the labor, and in return, you get a paycheck. And so that's all that's going on, is we're going from down here to up here, looking at how supply and demand for labor is changed. So, as we saw in the first week, you've got these 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. These have not changed. The land is the natural resources, labor is the actual workforce, the humans. Capital, you've got physical and human capital. Physical capital being the machinery and the tools. You know, that was the pizza oven and all that we needed. Human capital is the knowledge and the skill sets. And then entrepreneur is the person that actually gets it going. And so, but these have not changed at all and won't change ever. These remain the same. What has changed is these factor payments. So what do you get in return for these resources, for these factors of production? So now land is paid for in rent. Labor is paid in wage. Capital is paid in interest. Entrepreneurs are paid a profit. So that is the return for those resources being provided to the labor of the resource market. That, you know, if you provide land to the resource market, you're going to receive rent in return. If you supply your labor, when you go to work, you're going to receive a wage in return. And so those are just the trade-offs. What goes into the resource market versus what comes out of the resource market. But the big takeaway, like I said, is the labor market. Actually, you know, what is the supply and demand for workers in a particular industry? The law of demand, law of supply still exists. So demand's always twofold. You got to be willing and able to demand the labor, but now it's the businesses that are demanding the labor. So the businesses have to be willing and able to hire more workers. It's still an inverse relationship, that if the wage goes down that they have to pay the workers, then they're going to be willing to hire more workers. If the wage goes up, and we're going to talk about minimum wage here in a minute and how that affects the markets, but if the wage goes up, then the quantity demanded goes down. That same inverse relationship exists for the business as it did for the individual in the product market. The supply of labor is a direct relationship, that if the wage that's offered for a particular job goes up, well, more people are going to be willing to supply their labor to that market. You know, if you work a job making $10 an hour and then you find out, hey, I can go work over here for $20 an hour, most people are probably going to be more willing to supply their labor to that new market. So you see an increase in the quantity supplied when the wage increases. Same thing if the wage goes down, people aren't willing to work anymore. You're not going to work for less money. So you see a decrease in quantity demand. So those same relationships exist. Demand has an inverse relationship. Supply has a direct relationship, just as it did in the product market. The big thing that's changed from a graphing standpoint is you still have quantity on the x-axis. But instead of quantity of products, now it's quantity of workers in this market. And then instead of price, now it's a wage. And so we pay them a wage for the quantity of workers instead of a price for a product. But same inverse relationship between wage and the quantity demanded for workers. That the wage goes down, the businesses now have the demand. And so if the wage goes down, they're going to have a higher quantity demanded for workers. If the wage goes up, they're going to have a decrease in the quantity demanded because they either can't afford as many, or they're not willing to pay more, or for whatever reason, they're not going to be willing to hire as many. You ever see market? Remember, market just means a larger analysis. So if we take McDonald's and Burger King and all the other firms and we put all of their individual demand together, that gives us the market demand for labor. And this is really kind of what the real world looks at is, what's the market demand for labor right now in a particular industry? Is it a competitive wage? Do we need to raise the wage? What do we need to do to control these markets? But anytime you see the word market, it's just a bigger analysis. So, you, the individual, supplies the labor. If the wage goes up, the quantity supplied goes up because more people are willing and able to supply their labor to that market if you're paid a higher wage. If the wage goes down, not as many people are willing to supply their labor. That's that direct relationship. So, when we put it together, you've got the demand for labor, you've got the supply for labor, you've got an equilibrium wage and the equilibrium quantity. So, if this is the supply and demand for carpenters, well, at $30 an hour, then we hit that market equilibrium where the exact number of carpenters willing to supply their labor is exactly equal to the number of businesses willing to hire them. So once again, exactly like the product market, just workers instead of products. But equilibrium still exists. All right, so minimum wage. And to kind of just preface this before we go into it, the way College Board and theoretical economics explains minimum wage is it almost gives it a negative connotation. Not saying that raising the minimum wage is a bad thing, but we're going to look at the market effects of what happens and then how society has to counterbalance when those things happen. But in principle, minimum wage is a wage floor in the market. Just like we had a price floor in the product market, and we saw when a price floor was set above equilibrium, it created a minimum price, thus manipulating the market, creating a higher price in equilibrium, which in return created a surplus in the market, in the product market. Well, in the labor market, a minimum wage creates a minimum wage above equilibrium. And so it prevents the wage from getting back to that equilibrium point. And so, of course, the big topic is always, should the federal government impose a national $15 minimum wage? Well, what it's going to do is, let's say, I know Alabama doesn't have a minimum wage. We just accept whatever the national is. But, let's say whatever state we're in has an equilibrium wage of $8 for fast food cooks right now. Well, if the federal government imposes a $15 minimum wage, it's going to create a wage floor above equilibrium, which is going to manipulate the market. So if you're used to getting $8 and now you hear, hey, I can go over here and make $15, you think more people are going to be willing to work? Yeah. So you're going to see an increase in the quantity supplied for labor. But if I run a business and I'm used to paying people $8, but now I'm federally required to pay them $15, well, I'm probably not going to hire as many workers. I may not be able to afford as many workers based on my budget. And so what you end up seeing is a surplus of labor in these markets when these wages increase. Well, the surplus is considered unemployment because you have people willing to work or that are willing and able to work. Remember, it's twofold for supply, but there's not enough employers willing to employ them at the higher wage. So the way you kind of have to look at this is that when that wage increases, quantity supply is going to increase, quantity demand is going to decrease. So if this was the market before at $10 and $100, and then we see a essentially 100% increase in the wage, well, based on the quantities in this market, 30 people would lose their job, 50 people would be unemployed. This isn't to say that they're going to be out on the streets and they're just out of luck. There's plenty of other markets where they can probably supply their labor to, but in this particular market, when that wage is increased, you're going to see this unbalance, essentially, quantity supplied and quantity demand of labor in the market. And so the fact that it says fired and unemployed, though, people get fired up saying, well, this is saying raising the minimum wage is better. Not necessarily. I mean, it combats, you've got to remember, these are super simplified graphs as well, that by raising the minimum wage, we combat worser societal problems. That if people can't earn a living wage, then we see an increase in homelessness. We see an increase in foreclosure on houses and cars. We see a decline in health care. That there's all these negative things that happen from a societal standpoint. So yes, people have to be able to earn a living wage to survive. But from a theoretical economic standpoint, it's going to create a surplus of workers in the market and cause unemployment. So that's your trade-off. But of course, there's programs such as welfare, as Social Security for people that retire. For whatever reason, we have programs in place to combat this unemployment. So, don't automatically assume, well, College Board is against raising the minimum wage. No. You got to look at it from a simplified theoretical standpoint that it's going to create that imbalance. And essentially, it's going to create that surplus of workers in the market because you're going to have more people willing to work than demanded. So anyways, does that make sense? Okay. This is one of those times you got to step back and remember this is purely theoretical stuff we're dealing with, not social outrage. All right. So 2 terms that we do introduce, and this can be a little tricky to get the hang of, just because they're way more complicated than they really have to be. So we're going to talk about marginal resource cost, and then next we have a concept called marginal revenue product. All this is supply and demand. When we get to it, these are the supply and demand curves. We just call them super technical terms because why not? So, marginal resource cost. This is just the wage that workers are going to receive. This is whatever we're paying our workers. Because if you break down that definition, marginal, add 1 and look for the change. Resource, labor is a resource. And then the cost. So what is the additional cost for adding 1 more unit of labor? It's just the wage you have to pay them. Is all the marginal resource cost is. What are we going to pay the worker? I mean, it gives you the formula and the change in total cost divided by the change in inputs. And so if it ever changes, which I think it gives us the example at some point, but if it ever changes by more than 1 worker, then you've just got to divide the change by the number. But typically these things are always going to change 1 at a time. Not always. And so, I would make a note of that formula, but typically it's going to change 1 worker at a time. And so that's what we're looking at is what is the additional cost of each additional worker. When we finish Unit 5 or at the end of Unit 5, we'll see that there's, like we had 4 markets for products that we just looked at, perfect competition, monopolistic competition, all those. Well, there's 2 markets for labor too. One of them is going to have a perfectly elastic horizontal MRC. So we had Mr. Dart that went all the way across and the price of the product did not change. Well, one of the markets, we're going to have a perfectly elastic marginal resource cost, which means every worker gets paid the same thing. And then later on, we'll see something more like a monopoly where workers receive different wages. But there are going to be 2 different markets for labor we're going to look at. Marginal revenue product. This is how much additional money each new worker makes for the business. So once again, marginal, add 1 and look for the change. Revenue is the amount of money brought in by the business. And then product is how much are they producing. So when you hire a new worker, how much additional revenue is that new worker going to make for the business? So that same MR equals MC marginal analysis that you've done over and over and over in this class, this is just 1 more marginal analysis. So we're comparing how much do we have to pay the worker, which is the marginal resource cost, to how much revenue that particular worker generates. If you have to pay them more than the money that they generate for the business, you shouldn't have hired them. If they produce more revenue than what you have to pay them, they're a good worker. You should keep them. That's how the firm decides how many workers to hire. As long as your workers are generating more revenue than what you have to pay them, that's a good thing. If your workers are costing you more money than what they're making for you, you shouldn't have hired so many workers. And so that's all this is yet another marginal analysis, but just looking at how many workers should we hire based on what we have to pay them, how much revenue they generate. So, example. So we own some kind of landscaping business where we're mowing yards. The guy that wrote these lives in California. He calls them lawns. I can't call them a lawn. I have to call it a yard. This is Alabama. So anyways, you hire workers to mow yards. The wage for each worker is set at $100 a day. So no matter what, no matter how many, if they mow 1, whether they mow 20, it doesn't matter. Each worker is getting $100 a day. For every yard that they mow, you receive $50. So that's what they charge. Customer pays $50, customer pays $50, customer pays $50 for every yard that they mow. First worker, he can mow 4 yards by himself in a day. Second worker, together, only mows 5 yards. So how many additional yards did this guy, woman, person mow? 1. So 4 by themselves, you hired a new worker, it only increased the product by 1. So what is the MRC for each worker? How much are we paying each worker?
$50?
No,
Or $200?
no, $100.
Wait, you're paying each of them $100, I thought.
Yes. Remember, marginal, add 1 and look for the change though. So what is the marginal resource cost of each worker? $100. Because that's what we have to pay each worker. So marginal resource cost is just the wage each individual worker receives. What is the MRP for the first worker? So how much total revenue did that first worker generate for the firm? What? $200. So 4 yards, $50 a piece. That first worker generated $200 for the business. So you paid them $100. They generated $200. That's good. So your MRP was greater than your MRC. That's a good thing for a business.
And you don't want to hire the second worker.
Yeah, we're getting to that. But no, you don't. All right, so the second worker. How much additional revenue did that second worker generate?
$50.
$50. You have to pay them $100, but they only made you $50. That's not good. You're losing money on that second worker. And so really you're going to fire them because they're not very productive.
It honestly sounds like they're lazy. I mean, if one person can mow 4 and they can only mow 1, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. And of course there's a million different scenarios we can consider. And I'm about out of time, so let's hurry through this. So first worker is $200, second worker is $50. You're going to hire the first worker only, not the second one. It says, how much are you willing to pay the first worker? Well, I mean, I guess technically you're willing to pay them up to $199.99 because you just only want the MRC to be less than the MRP. How much are you actually going to pay them? Well, you're only going to pay them the $100 because you still want to profit as a business owner. And it says, what must happen to the wage in the market for you to hire the second worker? So the wage is essentially going to have to decrease, or they're going to have to get more productive. If that wage, if the MRC were to lower to $50, then it would at least be equal, and you could justify hiring that worker because you pay them $50, or you pay them, or actually, sorry, say that back. MRC is going to have to increase to $100, and so, or essentially their revenue is going to have to go up. But I mean, it's all that marginal analysis that. If you have to pay them more than what they generate, that's a bad thing. You should fire them. If the wage goes up, the wage goes down to equal whatever that resource cost is, then they're going to be all right. But it's going to have to change. Other reasons for market imperfections, insufficient or misleading job information. Sometimes people don't know better jobs are out there. Geographical immobility. Sometimes people just don't have the resources to leave their current situation and get a better job, even if they know there's better situations out there. Unions are collective groups of workers that essentially get better working conditions, pay whatever. It's collections of workers. And then, unfortunately, wage discrimination does occur. Of course, if it's on race, gender, age, any of that, it's horribly illegal, and they won't be in business very long if they are doing that. So, all right, and that is 5.1.